The Cold War. This term evokes images of espionage, nuclear threats, and a world on the brink. It was a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers that emerged from World War II. The conflict was ideological, with the capitalist West led by the United States and the communist East led by the Soviet Union vying for global dominance. The Cold War was not a hot war with direct military confrontations between the superpowers. However, it was a time of proxy wars, espionage, and a constant arms race. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the globe, shaping international relations and influencing domestic policies in numerous countries. From the late 1940s until the early 1990s, the world watched as these two superpowers engaged in a high-stakes chess match with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. One of the most potent symbols of this ideological divide was the Berlin Wall, a physical manifestation of the metaphorical Iron Curtain that separated East and West. The Berlin Wall stood as a stark reminder of the human cost of this global standoff. It was a symbol of oppression, division, and the stark realities of life under communist rule. Understanding the Berlin Wall requires understanding the broader context of the Cold War, the events that led to its construction and its eventual fall. In the aftermath of World War II, Germany, the primary aggressor, lay defeated and divided. The victorious Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. Berlin, although located deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This division of Germany and Berlin would become a major point of contention between the East and West. Initially, there were hopes for a unified and democratic Germany. However, these hopes were soon dashed as relations between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies deteriorated. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, began to install communist regimes in Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone between itself and the West. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, was formed from the American, British, and French zones. In response, the Soviet Union established the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, in its zone. The division of Germany solidified the Iron Curtain across Europe. The Iron Curtain symbolized the ideological and physical barrier that separated the communist East from the capitalist West. Movement between East and West became increasingly restricted and tensions continued to escalate. The stage was set for the construction of the Berlin Wall. Berlin, a city situated deep within the Soviet zone of Germany, became a focal point of Cold War tensions. West Berlin, a beacon of freedom and opportunity within communist East Germany, presented a problem for the Soviet Union. Millions of East Germans seeking a better life fled to the West through West Berlin. This mass exodus of skilled workers and intellectuals was a significant drain on the East German economy and an embarrassment to the communist regime. Furthermore, West Berlin stood as a symbol of Western resilience and a challenge to Soviet authority. The Soviets wanted to stop the flow of refugees and consolidate their control over East Germany. The construction of the Berlin Wall was their solution to this problem. It was a drastic measure, but one that the Soviet leadership felt was necessary to secure their interests. In 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, authorized the construction of the Berlin Wall. He argued that the wall was necessary to protect East Germany from Western aggression and to prevent the capitalist West from undermining the socialist state. However, the true purpose of the wall was clear: to stem the flow of refugees and solidify Soviet control over East Berlin. On August 13, 1961, the world awoke to a startling sight. East German troops and construction workers had begun erecting a barbed wire barrier that would soon become the Berlin Wall. This barrier, initially rudimentary, quickly evolved into a heavily fortified concrete wall complete with guard towers, watchdogs, and shoot-to-kill orders for those attempting to cross. The wall stretched for miles, physically and ideologically dividing East and West Berlin. The construction of the wall sent shockwaves across the globe. Families and friends were separated overnight, unable to cross the divide. The wall became a tangible symbol of Cold War division, a concrete manifestation of the ideological Iron Curtain. The world watched in disbelief as a city, once a symbol of unity and resilience, was brutally cleaved in two. The construction of the Berlin Wall marked a turning point in the Cold War. It solidified the division of East and West and heightened tensions between the superpowers. It also had a profound impact on the lives of ordinary people in Berlin, separating families, friends, and loved ones. The wall would stand for 28 years, a stark reminder of the human cost of the Cold War. Gap 3S. In the early 1960s, the Cold War was in full swing, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at an all-time high. On May 1, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace. The incident sent shockwaves through the international community. Gap 2S. The U-2 incident exposed the extent of the espionage efforts by the United States and embarrassed the Eisenhower administration. Powers, who survived the crash, was captured by Soviet forces and paraded as evidence of American espionage. The trial and conviction of Powers further strained the already fragile relations between the superpowers. Gap 2S, the downing of the U-2 spy plane, also had a significant impact on the ongoing disarmament talks between the United States and the Soviet Union. The incident led to the collapse of the Paris Summit, a critical meeting aimed at easing Cold War tensions. It became evident that trust between the two nations was at an all-time low. Gap 2S. For the people of Berlin, the U-2 incident was another reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The city stood at the crossroads of East and West, a potential flashpoint for global conflict. The Berlin Wall had only just been erected, and the U-2 incident underscored the dangers lurking beneath the surface of the political divide. Gap 2S. As the world watched the unfolding drama, the Cold War entered a new, more dangerous phase. The downing of the U-2 spy plane highlighted the lengths to which both sides would go to protect their interests and maintain their spheres of influence. It was a stark reminder that the ideological battle between East and West was far from over. Gap 2S. The spy plane incident marked a pivotal moment in Cold War history. It exposed the deep mistrust between the superpowers and demonstrated the high stakes of their geopolitical struggle. For Berliners, it was yet another chapter in their city's tumultuous history, a reminder of the ever-present threat of conflict in a divided world. Gap 3S. In the aftermath of the U-2 incident, diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union hit a new low. The incident had not only embarrassed the Eisenhower administration, but also shattered any remaining hopes for a swift resolution to Cold War tensions. Gap 2S. The collapse of the Paris Summit was a significant blow to diplomatic efforts. Leaders from the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and France had gathered with the aim of addressing critical issues such as disarmament and German reunification. However, the U-2 incident cast a long shadow over the proceedings, leading to a swift and acrimonious end to the talks. Gap 2S. The diplomatic fallout was not limited to the superpowers. Allies on both sides of the Iron Curtain were forced to re-evaluate their positions. NATO members expressed concern over the aggressive espionage tactics employed by the United States, while Warsaw Pact countries rallied behind the Soviet Union, condemning American provocations. Gap 2S. For the people of Berlin, the diplomatic fallout further deepened the sense of uncertainty and fear. The city, already divided by the newly constructed Berlin Wall, now found itself at the epicenter of a geopolitical tug-of-war. Families were separated, and the hope for reunification seemed more distant than ever. Gap 2S. The U-2 incident also had lasting effects on international espionage. Both superpowers ramped up their intelligence-gathering efforts, leading to a new era of covert operations and counterintelligence. The skies above Europe became a battleground for reconnaissance aircraft and spy satellites, each side seeking to outmaneuver the other. Gap 2S. As the world grappled with the implications of the U-2 incident, one thing became clear: the Cold War was far from over. The diplomatic fallout underscored the fragile nature of peace in a divided world where trust was a rare commodity and the threat of conflict loomed large. Gap 2S. The diplomatic fallout of the U-2 incident was a sobering reminder of the complexities of international relations during the Cold War. It highlighted the precarious balance of power and the ever-present risk of escalation. For the citizens of Berlin, it was yet another chapter in their ongoing struggle for freedom and unity in a world divided by ideology. Gap 3S. Gap 3S, the U-2 incident and the subsequent diplomatic fallout left a lasting mark on the Cold War landscape. Trust between the superpowers had been shattered and the world braced for the next inevitable confrontation. Gap 2S. In Berlin, the impact was immediate and profound. The Berlin Wall, already a symbol of division, now seemed an impenetrable barrier to any hope of reunification. Families torn apart by the wall faced an even bleaker future as the political climate grew colder and more hostile. Gap 2S. The United States and the Soviet Union doubled down on their military and espionage efforts. In the skies, reconnaissance missions became even more frequent and daring, each side seeking to gain the upper hand in a game of high-stakes espionage. The shadow of the U-2 incident loomed large over every mission, a constant reminder of the risks involved. Gap 2S. On the ground, the people of Berlin lived in a state of perpetual tension. The wall was not just a physical barrier, it was a constant reminder of the ideological divide that had come to define their lives. Every day they faced the harsh realities of a city and a world torn apart by conflicting ideologies. Gap 2S. Diplomatic channels remained strained, with little hope for meaningful dialogue. The leaders of the superpowers continued to posture and provoke, each move calculated to demonstrate strength and resolve. The possibility of a peaceful resolution seemed more remote than ever. Gap 2S. Yet amid the uncertainty and fear, the human spirit endured. Acts of defiance and bravery emerged as symbols of resistance against the oppressive regimes. Stories of escape attempts, some successful and others tragic, became part of the city's lore, a testament to the enduring desire for freedom and unity. Gap 2S. The aftermath of the U-2 incident was a sobering reminder of the precarious nature of peace during the Cold War. It underscored the fragility of international relations and the ever-present threat of escalation. For the citizens of Berlin, it was a stark reminder that their struggle for freedom was far from over. Gap 3S. As the world continued to navigate the treacherous waters of the Cold War, the lessons of the U-2 incident would not be forgotten. They served as a cautionary tale of the dangers of espionage and the complexities of diplomacy in an era defined by suspicion and rivalry. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. The Cold War, already simmering with tension, escalated rapidly in the wake of the U-2 incident. Both superpowers were now on high alert, their military arsenals growing at an unprecedented rate. Gap 2S. In the United States, the government ramped up its defense budget, investing heavily in new technologies and advanced weaponry. The space race, too, became a crucial battleground, with both nations vying for supremacy in the final frontier. Gap 2S. Across the Atlantic, the Soviet Union responded in kind. Parades showcasing their military might became a common sight, a clear message to the world that they were ready for any confrontation. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, further heightened the stakes, bringing the threat of nuclear war ever closer. Gap 2S. In Berlin, the city remained a focal point of this escalating conflict. The Berlin Wall, now fortified with additional security measures, became even more impenetrable. Surveillance was intensified, and any attempt to cross the border was met with swift and severe punishment. Gap 2S. The airwaves were flooded with propaganda from both sides, each portraying the other as the ultimate enemy. The media became a tool of psychological warfare, aiming to sway public opinion and maintain national morale. Gap 2S. For the people of Berlin, life became a daily struggle for survival. Resources were scarce, and the constant threat of conflict loomed large. Yet, amid the hardship, a spirit of resilience emerged. Underground networks formed to help those in need, and acts of kindness and solidarity became a quiet form of resistance. Gap 2S. Internationally, alliances were tested and new ones formed. NATO and the Warsaw Pact nations stood in stark opposition, each ready to defend their ideological territories. The world watched anxiously as the superpowers engaged in a dangerous dance, their every move scrutinized for signs of aggression. Gap 2S. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, a stark reminder of the fragile peace that hung by a thread. The resolution of the crisis, though a temporary reprieve, did little to ease the underlying tensions. Gap 2S. The Cold War had entered a new, more dangerous phase. The lessons of the past seemed forgotten as both sides prepared for an uncertain future. For the citizens of Berlin and the world, the hope for peace remained a distant dream, overshadowed by the ever-present threat of global conflict. Gap 3S. Gap 3S, October 1962. The world stood on the edge of a precipice as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. Gap 2S, American reconnaissance revealed that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The discovery sent shockwaves through the US government, triggering a tense 13-day standoff that brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. Gap 2S. President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation, informing the public of the imminent threat and announcing a naval blockade to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to Cuba. The announcement was met with a mixture of fear and resolve, as Americans braced for what could be an imminent conflict. Gap 2S. In the Kremlin, Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced immense pressure. The Soviet leader had to decide whether to escalate the situation or seek a diplomatic resolution. Communication channels between Washington and Moscow buzzed with urgent messages, each side wary of misinterpretation or miscalculation. Gap 2S. As the US Navy enforced the blockade, Soviet ships carrying additional missile supplies approached the quarantine line. The world watched with bated breath, knowing that a single misstep could trigger a catastrophic war. Gap 2S. Backdoor negotiations intensified, with both superpowers seeking a way to defuse the crisis without losing face. Eventually, a secret agreement was reached. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missiles in Cuba in exchange for the US promising not to invade the island and secretly agreeing to remove its own missiles from Turkey. Gap 2S. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, marking the end of the immediate crisis. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the close call left an indelible mark on international relations. Gap 2S. The Cuban Missile Crisis underscored the devastating potential of nuclear weapons and highlighted the need for more effective communication between superpowers. It led to the establishment of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, a tangible step toward preventing future misunderstandings. Gap 2S. Yet, the underlying tensions of the Cold War persisted. The crisis had shown just how fragile global peace was, and the specter of nuclear annihilation continued to loom over the world. For the people of Berlin and beyond, the hope for a lasting peace remained elusive, overshadowed by the ever-present threat of renewed conflict. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. As the dust settled from the Cuban Missile Crisis, a new battleground emerged in the Cold War space. Gap 2S. The space race became a symbol of technological prowess and ideological superiority, with both the United States and the Soviet Union vying for dominance beyond Earth's atmosphere. Gap 2S. In 1957, the Soviet Union took an early lead by launching Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The achievement stunned the world and sent the United States into a frenzy, spurring the creation of NASA in 1958. Gap 2S. The competition intensified, with each side pushing the boundaries of human ingenuity. Gap 2S. The Soviets made another significant leap in 1961 when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. His successful mission was a monumental triumph for the USSR and a stark reminder of the stakes involved in this celestial contest. Gap 2S. Determined to catch up, the United States poured resources into its space program, culminating in President Kennedy's ambitious pledge to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Gap 2S. The Apollo program became the centerpiece of America's efforts, showcasing the nation's technological might and unyielding spirit. Gap 2S. On July 20th, 1969, the world watched in awe as Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the lunar surface, uttering the iconic words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Gap 2S. The moon landing was not just a victory for the United States, it was a testament to human potential and the power of exploration. Gap 2S. While the space race was fueled by rivalry, it also fostered a sense of wonder and possibility. Gap 2S. The advancements made during this period laid the groundwork for future space exploration and cooperation, reminding humanity of what could be achieved when we reach for the stars. Gap 2S. Yet, even as astronauts ventured into space, the Cold War's terrestrial conflicts continued to simmer. Gap 3S. The space race may have been won, but the struggle for global influence was far from over. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. As the Cold War stretched into the late 20th century, the Berlin Wall stood as a grim symbol of division and oppression. Gap 2S. Erected in 1961, it not only split East and West Berlin, but also embodied the ideological chasm between communism and democracy. Gap 2S. For nearly 3 decades, families were separated, lives were lost, and the Iron Curtain seemed impenetrable. Gap 2S. Yet beneath the surface, the winds of change were beginning to stir. Gap 2S. In the 1980s, a wave of reform swept through the Soviet Union under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gap 2S. His policies of glasnost and perestroika aimed to open up the Soviet society and economy, creating ripples of hope across Eastern Europe. Gap 2S. Meanwhile, in East Germany, discontent was growing. Gap 2S. Citizens began to demand greater freedoms and an end to the oppressive regime. Gap 2S. The pressure reached a tipping point on November 9, 1989, when a botched announcement led to the opening of the Berlin Wall. Gap 2S. That night, thousands of East Berliners surged through the checkpoints, reuniting with their Western counterparts in scenes of jubilation and disbelief. Gap 2S. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than just a physical collapse. It marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War. Gap 2S. It symbolized the triumph of human spirit over tyranny and the yearning for unity and freedom. Gap 2S. In the months that followed, the momentum of change continued to sweep through Eastern Europe, leading to the collapse of communist regimes and the reunification of Germany in 1990. Gap 2S. The fall of the Berlin Wall remains one of the most poignant moments in history, a testament to the power of hope and the inevitability of change. Gap 2S. It serves as a reminder that even the most formidable barriers can be overcome when people unite for a common cause. Gap 3S. With the wall down and the Cold War nearing its end, the world stood on the brink of a new era, one filled with both challenges and opportunities. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. As the Berlin Wall fell, the world watched in awe. But this monumental event was just the beginning of the end for the Cold War. Gap 2S. The collapse of the Soviet Union was imminent, but the journey to that point was fraught with complex political maneuvers and dramatic shifts in global power. Gap 2S. In the early 1990s, the Soviet economy was in shambles and its political structure was crumbling. Gap 2S. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had opened the floodgates for change, but they also exposed deep-seated weaknesses within the Soviet system. Gap 2S. Nationalist movements gained momentum, and republics within the Soviet Union began to declare independence. Gap 2S. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were among the first to break away, setting a precedent for others to follow. Gap 2S. In August 1991, a failed coup by hardline communists attempted to reverse Gorbachev's reforms, but it only hastened the Soviet Union's demise. Gap 2S. Boris Yeltsin, then president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a key figure, rallying the people against the coup plotters and solidifying his power. Gap 2S. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved, marking the end of an era. Gap 2S. The United States and its allies celebrated the collapse of their longtime adversary, but the aftermath was complex and multifaceted. Gap 2S. The end of the Cold War brought new challenges, including the transition to market economies, the rise of new political dynamics, and the need for international cooperation in a rapidly changing world. Gap 2S. The dissolution of the Soviet Union also led to the emergence of new nations, each with its own unique path to forge in the post-Cold War era. Gap 2S. Despite the uncertainties, the end of the Cold War symbolized the triumph of diplomacy and the potential for a more peaceful world. Gap 2S. It was a time of reflection, as the global community considered the lessons learned from decades of tension and conflict. Gap 2S. The end of the Cold War was not just the conclusion of a geopolitical struggle, it was the dawn of a new age, one where the hope for lasting peace and cooperation could finally take root. Gap 3S. As we look back on this pivotal moment in history, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring quest for freedom and unity. Gap 3AS.